Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you here to our webinar. I'm thrilled that you can join us. Today, we're going to be talking about the board meeting number 30 from the Green Climate Fund, the GCF, that has just taken place last week, and also talking about our study that we did, our GCF Insight study on the engagement of the private sector and some of the challenges that the private sector experience in engaging with the Green Climate Fund. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. We are going to kick off straight away and get moving with our agenda. But just before I do that, I'll make a brief introduction of myself. My name is Grant Ballard-Tremeer. I'm going to be facilitating and hosting this webinar today. I'm the director of the company ECO. I set it up now around 21 years ago. So the company is focused entirely on climate finance and on mobilizing climate finance. My background is as an engineer. I was born and brought up in South Africa. I've lived in the UK running this company now for the past 21 years. And we have worked in projects around the world in developing country, ensuring low carbon climate resilient project designs reflect best practice. They are ones that can be delivered, that can be implemented, that can produce lasting results. So that's the mission that I take on myself, and that's the mission of our company ECO. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. Just as we get going, let me ask if you would kindly introduce yourself and participate as we go along. There's a good chat function. You can introduce yourself. Hello to all of you that have already. Hello, Deepa. Hello, Camille. Hello, Lion and Peter. It's a great pleasure that you have for us to see you today. I'm recognizing some of the names of people that are here. Please do go ahead and introduce yourself. And also, as we go, you will also see that there are various polls that are available to complete. It's very helpful for us to get an insight into the audience, what particular priorities you might have, the region that you work in, the type of organization that you come from. So please, when you see that poll tab, just click on the poll and choose your option and submit your vote. That'll be a very useful insight as we go along. We're, of course, running the webinar live, and we'll be able to respond to questions that you have along the way. Now, I mentioned that my company ECO works on climate finance projects around the world. One of those areas, and a real focal area, is the Green Climate Fund. And we have a lot of interesting assignments related to the Green Climate Fund. I want to just a little plug for the possibility, if you know anyone who is really an outstanding candidate that could potentially be interested in working with us as an employee or as an associate or as a consultant, maybe yourself or maybe someone else, please do follow the link that my colleague Jessica is putting in the chat. Refer people to us. If you know of anyone that might be suitable, we're really trying to recruit some great candidates over the next month and a half. So if you know any opportunities, we'd be really grateful if you could pass on the word for that, or maybe apply yourself. Right, so the agenda that we're going to do, I've mentioned the polls already. We're going to have a time for questions and answers. This will come up after the various presentations, but do feel free to post your comments and your questions as we go, so that we know which ones they are. And there's also a way of voting up questions that other people have asked. Do get onto that, and if a question that someone else has asked resonates for you, then upvote it. But we'll have that usual Q&A. Also to mention that we'll make available a package of the materials that include the presentations, the recording of the presentation, and we'll distribute that after the webinar. So you'll be able to get a copy of all of the materials that are here. Now, we're going to be talking about the Green Climate Fund board meeting and our GCF Insight on private sector engagement. We are very privileged to have two speakers today, so it's not just me. One of them is our senior analyst, Marcus Arcanjo. He will be talking about the work he did on our 19th GCF Insight publication. And I'm really thrilled to welcome today as well Margaret-Ann Splawn. She's from the CMIA. She is the active observer for private sector at the GCF. So if you have seen any of the GCF board events, you will see that Margaret-Ann speaks up regularly on behalf of the private sector, and I think it's safe to say on behalf of Sanity as well, to put forward a viewpoint related to that private sector perspective. So it's a great privilege that she's joining us today. All right, so I think that's it. All the background, all the introductory things. Please do submit questions as we go along, and let's get going. So firstly, my colleague Marcus will present a study we carried out on how the private sector can boost engagement with the GCF, how the GCF can boost engagement with the private sector. It goes both ways, I think. Marcus Arcanjo has an MSc in Development and Security from the University of Bristol and a BSc in Business Economics from Cardiff University. He's a researcher with our team, an analyst working on climate finance projects, including for the Green Climate Fund and the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, and in climate action planning related to cities. Well, Marcus, over to you.
Thank you, Grant, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I'll be discussing our latest report, GCF Insight number 19, which focuses specifically on how the private sector can boost engagement with the Green Climate Fund. This is a topic that we've discussed internally at ECO as well as with our clients, and we hope that the information provided in this report will help you in your project design. So the place to start will be to discuss why the private sector is so important in addressing climate change. The sector represents approximately $210 trillion in financial resources, yet only a very small proportion of that focuses on climate investments. Considering the enormous scale of the climate crisis, significantly greater engagement and financial flows are needed from the private sector in order to help limit these impacts. To overcome the gaps in financing between where we are currently and where we need to be, the GCF introduced the Private Sector Facility, which is a dedicated division within the fund designed to mobilise finance for private sector projects. This can be done via enhancing cooperation, participation and encouraging engagement with institutional investors and other private sector actors. The GCF also aims to leverage GCF's funds to encourage corporations and corporates to co-invest with them. However, the current GCF portfolio is still imbalanced between private and public sector projects. For example, $3 billion worth of projects accounting for 20% in the total number and a third in the total amount of money dispersed are within the private sector, whereas 80% in the total number of projects and 2/3 of total investment value come from the public sector. The goal of this report is to try and find why these imbalances occur and what can be done to reduce them. To inform this report, we conducted a survey and semi-structured interviews throughout September of this year. We received 39 responses from our survey from stakeholders, and we interviewed 2 representatives of the private sector. In terms of the survey respondents' breakdowns, 57% represented the private sector, 39% were public sector representatives with an interest in private sector projects, and the remaining 4% represented NGOs. Of these respondents, a quarter work on private sector GCF projects at least once a year, with an additional 14% working on these projects less frequently. Approximately half of all respondents expect to work on private sector projects to submit to the GCF in the future. The objective of this report is to uncover the struggles that the private sector faces in navigating the project design and approval processes of the GCF. By better understanding where the biggest hurdles lie for the private sector, we hope to identify areas of frequent difficulty, as well as identify possible ways to address them. We hope that this will enable private sector stakeholders to avoid or at least successfully navigate the common pitfalls in the GCF processes. We ask stakeholders to provide their inputs on GCF projects that they've put together, as well as how they think the GCF could improve in terms of engaging with the private sector, and especially through the private sector facility. So, what did our report find? I'll deep dive into each of these in a bit more detail in the following slides, but I'll touch on them briefly here. Firstly, respondents struggled to fully understand what the GCF is looking for from the private sector in terms of the projects they should design. They also noted that overly complicated jargon and the processes make the fund difficult to navigate, especially for those without specific climate change expertise and knowledge. Secondly, many respondents said that they struggled with access to the fund, and they found that the existing processes limit access for private sector actors, especially for medium and smaller companies in developing countries, which are also the same areas that the fund targets. As a result of this, many private sector actors end up giving up on the GCF and seeking opportunities elsewhere that are more suited to them. Lastly, the vast majority of respondents, as well as our interviewees, noted that the current processes of the GCF are far too long to be attractive to the private sector. The multi-month process of project review often leads to a length of time waiting that the private sector are unwilling and unable to wait for, as they'd like to identify investments and make them as soon as possible, rather than waiting for many months or possibly even years to work through the GCF process. A major challenge identified by the survey was difficulties and uncertainty surrounding what exactly the GCF is looking for in private sector projects. Approximately 54% of our survey respondents cited this as a stumbling block in their project design. One interviewee mentioned that the largest challenge they see is understanding the fund itself and how best to work with it. They said that there's so many moving parts and components within the fund that this leads to an overcomplication, which can often lead to the private sector losing interest. Equally, many people said that the semantics and the abundance of specialist terms are not aligned with the private sector goals. They feel as though the GCF expects entities preparing proposals to be experts in climate change, which is pretty unrealistic for many private sector companies. One survey respondent noted that it feels like every single thing has to be covered within the funding proposal, but they have no idea which one it is that moves the needle, and suggested that prescriptive guidance relevant specifically to the private sector will be far more beneficial and improve the capacity of the private sector to design these projects. This point on a lack of climate change knowledge was repeated multiple times by many different people. Several said that the best way to overcome this would be to simplify the private sector facility, because most of the private sector companies do not have the sufficient environmental and climate change knowledge. Another noted that a significant lack of technical know-how on crafting successful project proposals exists in the sector. A second recurring theme from our study was that most people found accessing GCF resources quite challenging. For example, one said that very few private sector companies will ever want to become an accredited entity, and therefore the process of engaging with existing AEs may be very long and stressful. Many people noted that accessing GCF resources for micro, small and medium enterprises can be near impossible given the size of projects needed to approach the GCF. This can be especially frustrating for some in the private sector because the fund places a focus on small island developing states and least developed countries, which tend to have fewer large companies. To overcome this, some suggested that there is a need for the GCF to take into account the unique challenges faced by these smaller companies in accessing climate finance. and provide information on what business opportunities exist in climate change mitigation and adaptation that the private sector in LDCs can invest in. One interviewee suggested that to overcome these challenges, the GCF could trial innovations such as a project-specific accreditation framework. This could be a significantly simpler process that would allow the private sector to gain accreditation for single projects. They believe that the GCF could use the private sector facility as an opportunity for a new flagship approach that could significantly boost private sector engagement. The final issue that this report highlighted is something that we've touched on previously, and that's the length of GCF processes. Approximately 54% of respondents stated that long processes are an off-putting and regular challenge that they face. This is an especially important point when we engage with the private sector. Our respondents noted that private sector investors want to use their capital to generate returns in a quicker way, so as soon as an investment is identified, rather than having to wait for many months or years when moving from step to step within the GCF process. One interviewee told us that the GCF, quote, assumes the private sector has infinite patience and capital, which is incorrect and makes it a painful process. They also pointed to patient capital being far less available in the private sector than the public sector, which therefore requires the GCF to take a much more streamlined approach when engaging private sector stakeholders. And both interviewees and survey respondents stated that while they understand that the GCF has a mandate to disperse large sums of money and therefore needs to undertake significant due diligence to ensure that approved projects conform to this mandate, they feel as though the current waiting period to obtain resources is unreasonably long. And they believe that this is a key reason why fewer private sector projects are being presented to the board, because private sector will often pursue other promising opportunities with faster turnaround times, even though the GCF provides significantly more resources and opportunities that could be leveraged. Having identified several challenges in existing processes, we asked survey respondents and interviewees what the GCF could do to improve the private sector facility and help engage private sector more effectively. Multiple people pointed to the simplification of processes, with one even saying that they'd like the simplified approval process to actually be simplified. The simplified approval process was introduced to streamline and shorten the process, but people seeking to use it often feel that there is very little benefit compared to the standard submission process. Secondly, people pointed to a potential new private sector strategy about which they were very optimistic. They believed that an introduction of a new strategy would provide new opportunities for the GCF to talk directly with the private sector to better understand their needs. And both interviewees told us that they were hopeful that creative solutions exist that will serve both the private sector and the GCF. And finally, to help combat some of the lack of technical knowledge and climate change understanding that we highlighted earlier, we asked respondents whether specific guidance would help them in their project design, and 92% of them said yes. In terms of what topics would help, these range broadly, but they include sector-specific guidance on concept notes and funding proposal development, potential opportunities for blended finance, guidance on preferred pathways for incorporating for-profit firms within project design, and technical aspects of successful project proposals, so specifically looking at success stories within the private sector that people could mimic in their own project design. This report has highlighted several sticking points that hinder progress towards the approval of more projects that include the private sector. However, both survey respondents and interviewees pointed to enormous opportunities that the GCF provides and were positive about future progress. One interviewee stated that every single communication that they've had with the private sector facility has been constructive, and also pointed to the fact that the GCF, as a flagship fund, has every chance of delivering on its mandate if it can make processes easier and engage more effectively, especially with the private sector. We note that the GCF has set an ambitious plan to step up its private sector investment in 2021, which is set to be a crucial year for progress on climate change, with COP26 less than a month away. Part of how the GCF can help build the knowledge of the private sector, boost engagement, and make the fund a more attractive option is through continued relationship building and publication of resources. The fund hosts an annual GCF Private Investment for Climate Conference, GCIP, which convenes global leaders from business, governments and financial institutions with the goal of accelerating private sector-driven climate action. This year, the conference is in October, and we hope that the outcomes will be useful for all involved in private sector project development. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I'll pass it back over to Grant.
Great. Thank you very much, Marcus. Really appreciate those insights from the study we did. We'll return to a number of those questions that you, the points that you were making and questions that one might ask based on those a little bit later. But right now, I've got great pleasure in welcoming Margaret-Ann Splawn to the call, to the webinar today. As I mentioned at the beginning, many of you who have seen the GCF board meetings may recognize Margaret-Ann because she's the active observer for that. But she's also a climate policy, finance and investment consultant and a member of the Energy and Resource Efficiency Task Force of the B.20. In case you're wondering what the B.20 is, that's a task force that has been set up alongside or by the G20 for engagement with business. She's executive director of the Climate Markets and Investment Association, the CMIA, and as I mentioned, of course, an active observer to the GCF and a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society. Margaret-Ann is a strength that helps drive forward public-private partnerships among key actors at all levels of climate finance, and making a huge difference in the world. So Margaret-Ann, she's going to give us some insights on the private sector elements of the board meeting, and of course will be available for questions later on as well. So any questions you have, please do put them into the question tab, which we'll get to when we get to the Q&A section. So without further ado, Margaret-Ann, over to you.
Thanks so much for inviting me here today to speak about the recent 30th meeting of the GCF board. I am the active private sector observer representing the developed nations constituency and intervene with the board and secretariat on behalf of the private sector. In order to do this, I speak with a variety of private sector stakeholders at the GCF, from accredited entities to the private sector facility, secretariat, etc. This role is about facilitating private sector development and finance at the GCF. Well, it's been a record year of funding for the UN Green Climate Fund. Nearly $3 billion has been approved by the board in 2021 when we tally up with the $1.2 billion of funding approved last week. This sends a signal ahead of the crucial COP26 meeting that the Green Climate Fund is fulfilling its role to deliver support for climate action in developing countries, said co-chair Jose de Luna Martinez from Mexico in a GCF news update. This brings the total size of the GCF portfolio to $10 billion, representing $37.2 billion in assets, including co-financing. There were 13 new projects for mitigation and adaptation approved by the board, with the majority of new funds, 59% in grant equivalent terms, allocated for adaptation. Just over half of the new funding will go to small island developing states, least developed countries, and African states, which are particularly vulnerable to climate change. 4 of the 13 projects, representing $475 million of the $1.2 billion, were from the private sector, and 3 of the 4 newly approved funding proposals include innovative programs to catalyze private sector climate finance in adaptation. This marks a noticeable change as GCF investment into adaptation projects has thus far mostly concentrated on public sector-driven initiatives. Adaptation finance is hard to attract, and specifically from the private sector. It has been noted that by 2030, up to $300 billion per year would be needed globally for climate adaptation in developing countries alone. But adaptation receives only 5% of all climate finance and less than $500 billion of private investment. The GCF private sector projects approved can be found on this slide. You'll notice that most of them are programs spanning across various countries. The first one, Funding Proposal 178, is a mitigation project submitted by the African Development Bank, and approval brings the total of projects for the AFDB to a total of 8. The Multilateral Development Bank now has a mixed portfolio at the GCF combined of 3 public sector and 5 private sector projects. For this presentation, I want to highlight briefly the adaptation projects because I can't recall seeing 3 private sector adaptation projects presented to the board in one meeting. The first up is the Tanzania Agricultural Climate Adaptation Technology Deployment Program. This project was brought forward by the CRDB Bank in the United Republic of Tanzania. CRDB Bank is a direct access entity and was the first commercial bank in East and Central Africa to become accredited at the GCF. This is their first approved project. This program will strengthen resilience of Tanzania's agricultural sector by facilitating access to agriculture climate adaptation technologies. This will be achieved by establishing a lending and de-risking facility that will make these technologies affordable to local farmers and agricultural enterprises, accompanied by technical assistance and support from government authorities. The next 2 proposals were brought forward to the board by Pegasus Capital Advisors. Pegasus Capital is the first U.S. private equity fund manager accredited by the GCF. They already have 1 program with GCF funding, and approval at B.30 brought their total GCF portfolio to 3 programs. The GCF board approved $125 million in equity participation at the $500 million investment window of the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, representing the GCF's first path-breaking investment at scale in the blue economy climate adaptation sector. The GFCR fund targets private sector investments and addresses critical financing and investment barriers in the blue economy sector across 17 target countries, including a good blend of SIDS and LDCs. The proposal is a unique public-private partnership model which is supported by a capitalized grant window. The investment window will provide capital to private sector businesses and activities that reduce or eliminate local stressors in the most resilient reefs or climate refugia. The GCF also committed $100 million in catalytic capital to CRAFT, a program designed to scale up adaptation finance and accelerate development, application, and transfer of private sector technologies in climate adaptation and resilience. Implemented with Pegasus Capital Advisors, the CRAFT program supports investment in 6 technologies: agricultural analytics, water harvesting and irrigation, food systems, geospatial mapping and imaging, catastrophe risk and modeling, and supply chain analytics in 6 countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. 6 countries in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The executing entity of the program is Lightsmith Group, the experienced private equity firm in climate resilience in food and agriculture, water, energy, health, and transport. While the $1.2 billion was the biggest approval at the board meeting to date, the board could not agree on a way forward on several outstanding policy items. The simplified approval process and long-awaited updated accreditation framework were discussed at length again at this board meeting, yet no clear way forward was agreed. This is a hindrance for the private sector. The timeline, procedures, and processes to work with the GCF are extremely cumbersome. The continued lack of policy advances on these matters slows down progress for additional partners, especially direct access entities, which is a target group of the GCF. There were 4 accredited entities up for reaccreditation and 3 were approved. However, the board could not agree on the reaccreditation of the Development Bank of South Africa. The GCF is currently developing a new private sector strategy. There is a new director of the private sector facility, Henry Gonzalez, who started in September. After more than 18 months of searching for a new director, we welcome this new hire and look forward to working with him and his team, as there is an underrepresentation of the private sector at the GCF. We will continue to encourage opportunities for simplifying and increasing flexibility at the fund in order to build private sector engagement, capacity, and ultimately finance. Let me finish by sharing just a little bit about the Climate Markets and Investment Association. We are a non-profit trade association aiming to lead a coalition of private sector actors to mobilize the trillions needed to enable a transition to a climate-resilient, low-carbon, sustainable economy. We're an accredited NGO to the COP, so we'll have a delegation at COP26 in Glasgow. If you will be at COP26 and want to meet up for a coffee or a glass of wine, just get in touch. CMIA is active private sector observer at the GCF and also at the World Bank's climate investment funds. Our membership is comprised of a variety of private sector companies working in climate finance and investment. Some of them are accredited entities to the GCF, and others, such as ECO, have specific interests in GCF through providing capacity building or project proposal preparation. I have a distribution list for private sector GCF related matters, so do drop me an email if you want to be on this, or get in touch with me if you want to know more about membership in the association. Thank you so much, and back over to you, Grant.
Thank you very much, Margaret-Ann. Much appreciated. Yes, we're proud members of the CMIA. Happy to be with you in that organization, and thankful for all the work that you do, Margaret-Ann, related to private sector and climate finance in many different funds, not just the GCF. Thank you very much for those insights. Now, I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of my insights on the board meeting that has just taken place. Let me just get my slides up and ready, and then I will set off. Okay, here we go. Right, so these are going to be some observations on the board meeting. We kind of think of it as saving you the process of sitting through and watching different parts of the board meeting, so we can give you a summary of core things that happened. But I'm also going to give you a little bit of my interpretation of those factors. Just to emphasize, these opinions are really my own. They're not necessarily shared by others. I tend to be fairly outspoken. I tend to speak my mind. I think it's better to speak your mind than just to say types of platitudes. So you're going to get straight talking from me on different factors, questioning and thinking. One of the things that we do at ECO is deeper thinking. We don't just look at things superficially, but we go in and we understand deeply what is happening, and we try to understand perspectives. Also, just to let you know as I get going that I'm an outside observer. I have not been participating myself in the board meetings, just watching, just seeing what happens. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. I don't have any special insight into that. We're intensely involved in the design of climate finance projects. And in fact, we had some role on 3 of the 13 projects that were developed, a very minor one on one of them, and 2 of them we were the key consultants that was developing the proposal itself. So we are very much involved in that area, and my perspectives come from that point of view. So these are some observations, and I wanted to speak briefly about the update of the SAP. You may know SAP stands for Simplified Approval Process, the process that was introduced some years ago in order to address various different aspects of challenges within the Green Climate Fund for direct access entities and for smaller projects, and the idea of simplification, of making things facilitated, more easily accessible, and accelerated to speed things up. I'm going to give some views on where things are around that. Margaret-Ann mentioned that, in fact, there wasn't anything agreed at the board meeting, but I think there's some useful insights into what board meeting members are thinking. I'm going to talk a little bit about the approved projects. Margaret-Ann has already introduced us to 4 of them, those private sector projects. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the other ones as well. Some few words on the accreditation, or I may call it the reaccreditation process, because right now there are a large number of accredited entities that are due to become reaccredited. So all 3 of the accredited entities that were discussed around accreditation were there for reaccreditation. So they've already been accredited and we're coming back for reaccreditation. And then just some insight on the next board meetings. I know that's a hot topic. We want to know, when do we need to submit certain things? When can we expect things to happen? So I've got some insights on that as well, because the board approved the next 4 board meetings, somewhat tentatively for number 2, 3, and 4, but the first one of next year, we know absolutely for certain the dates that that's going to occur. And they actually approved all the others, but agreed to revisit it. So let's talk about the SAP. And just once again, as I get into talking about the SAP, if you have questions, please do ask them on the questions tab. We will have at least 15 minutes in this webinar to address questions. And Marcus and Margaret-Ann and myself will be happy to do so. So the SAP, there was an assessment of it, independent assessment from June 2020 that was presented at this board meeting. A number of the key findings of that really had to do with essentially there were 3 core SAP criteria that had to be met, and one of them around being ready, the project needs to be ready for scale up. The evaluation really, one of the key findings found that what does that actually mean is not being defined, and it's certainly not applied consistently. And also noted that there were no projects excluded based on that criteria. That idea of scale up is something that we talk about a lot with our clients in the training that we do on climate finance. Really, what does that mean? This idea of scale up and paradigm shift. So it's an important aspect to understand there. For me, a major finding here was around this no significant difference in time taken from concept note submission to funding proposal approval. 365, a whole year from the submission of the concept note to approval for the SAP versus 399, I think statistically probably no difference whatsoever. Bear in mind that SAP projects should be simpler. Of course, the GCF is trying to get more direct access entities that perhaps have fewer resources and capabilities and experience with this type of project. So that is one of the challenges that the GCF is facing here. But at the same time, these are simplified and smaller projects. So this difference is just so striking. And the assessment also concluded the same level of scrutiny is applied for SAP projects versus regular process. To me, those final 2 bullets really just make the point that, well, I don't really see what's simplified about the simplified approval process. We always advise, if they meet the criteria, that our clients or others developing projects go for the simplified approval process, but it's a little bit of hope, I suppose, that things could be better and simplified. We do, and the assessment really agreed that the GCF Secretariat is providing a good service related to SAP. They are very responsive. The team that is leading the SAP was commended within that assessment. So I mean, that's great. And I mean, the response was also discussed at this board meeting from the Secretariat. And I'd say there was agreement on quite a number of the factors and partial agreement on others. You can access those documents, and in the shared package we'll send around after the webinar, we will include links to those to the Secretariat's response to that assessment. The Secretariat then brought back the proposed agreement, the proposed update to the simplified approval process. You'll recall that this process was intended as a pilot. So this is the update that is proposed. It was initially put forward at board meeting 28 and brought back again now to discuss with a number of changes that had been made. One of them was the removal of the approval, the delegated authority for the executive director of the fund to be able to approve projects. That was removed from this, and a number of other suggestions and changes were made. The proposed update here really is summarized. The idea was to put forward an expansion of eligibility of projects and programs related to the environmental and social safeguards, the impacts, and to lift it from category C projects to category B projects. For that, the feedback from the board was really that only a few of the board members really bought into that, at least those that spoke up during the board meeting. there was quite some skepticism from both developed country constituencies and developing country constituencies that is probably and possibly not the right thing to do, with a few exceptions to it. The second point is around expansion of the funding from the current maximum threshold for GCF. It's currently at 10 million with a total project size of 20 million. To expand the amount that GCF could fund under these projects to 20 million or to 50 million or to this whole long sentence that you can see on the screen now. That all feels a little bit like a mobile phone contract to me, where there are so many terms and conditions that it is very difficult to navigate. I'm personally, just to give my little bit of opinion on this, I'm personally skeptical about that type of expansion and the need for that. But the 20 million, I think, was warmly welcomed and broadly welcomed by the board. The third point, really here about the non-mandatory submission of concept notes for SAP, all the feedback we heard from the board was supportive of that. My opinion, again, is that it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. We have not worked once with a client who has said that it's a good idea to miss the concept note for a SAP or for a full funding proposal. The sort of attitude is, why would you miss the SAP? Why would you miss the concept note? It just seems to me neither here nor there. Who really cares about that non-mandatory submission of concept notes? If you have the chance of putting in a concept before a full proposal, I would certainly advise to do that, because you can get earlier feedback from the GCF on core issues. Doesn't seem to be an important issue to me, but it was in the proposed update. And finally, and board members agreed to it. Finally, approval of SAP funding proposals by the board on a no objection basis between board members, what they call BBM, for between board members, between meetings. And I would say there was a mixed reaction to that. Many people approving it, one of the board members not, and the civil society observer certainly not agreeing to that because of reduced transparency and reduced communication, and the need, in their opinion, to put forward this idea to speak at the board. Participating in the boards themselves, watching it, listening to it, I don't find a lot of value from the discussions that take place. You'll hear a little bit more that is there. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that. I do know from experience that the questions that board members ask before the board meeting of the accredited entity are hugely helpful, I think, in building understanding and also in addressing things. And I'll mention that related to the African Development Bank's project, one of those areas where I think the board's questions really supported clarifications from the African Development Bank. All right, so straight on to the approved projects that we have here. Essentially, there were 13 of them, as we've heard mentioned before. The first one, quite a fascinating project, and one of the reasons that I know a lot about that is that we were privileged to work with SPC, be contracted to SPC to help develop that. So this is an adaptation project that is under the enhanced direct access modality. So it's requesting 16 million funding from the GCF for it. So this is the first one that is there. It got positive feedback from board members. There was compliments given to the, particularly from civil society, around the locally driven approach, the gender assessment, that the gender assessment was built into the design. So if you're designing a project, I really do recommend that. We start off our training on project design around understanding the gender impacts and looking at a project from an engendered lens. We strongly recommend that. That project sailed through without any requests and discussion there. Second project had a lot of discussion, so I might come back and give some insight into that particular one. The Timor-Leste project was one that was at the board meeting. Well, actually, we heard that it had been not approved to go forward by the ITAP. So that project was resubmitted and was approved this time without any comment whatsoever. This project is really a fascinating one, the fourth one here. Really interesting in that it is direct access entity from Nepal, a fascinating sector of it in clean cooking area. And it is entirely a mitigation project. Although clean cooking has a lot of co-benefits related to reduced vulnerability and is often working with most vulnerable people, this project was submitted and approved as an entirely mitigation project. And then the Amazon project, on this one, there were quite a few comments from civil society around consultations with Indigenous peoples. We see Civil Society Observer making these types of comments frequently. I think it's a really valuable service that civil society are doing and checking these aspects, contacting local civil society in the countries to gauge their level of consultation. The response from the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, was very comprehensive around consultations that had taken place and around consultations specifically dealing with Indigenous peoples. And the board simply, I think, took that, understood those sorts of insights in terms of the stakeholder engagement. You're designing a project, however, I think this is an important aspect to pay attention to, just make sure that there is real and substantive consultation taking place in the design of the project. It was a very, very large project as well. Okay, the next one around the dry corridor. This was also one of the projects that went for further discussion later. There was a condition that was added around disbursement. Those conditions were from ITAP. Those conditions were fully accepted by the accredited entity, but there was quite some discussions around those aspects. The CSO observers were also making some comments around the Indigenous peoples, the aspects of no, actually not on this particular one. That was on the Nepal project. Sorry, just misreading my notes here. All right, the NEMA project went through without any comments whatsoever, was proposed. The same for the BOAD project. These were just without any commentary, were approved with no response from the board. The cooling facility project had a comment related to the Montreal Protocol, and they agreed at a later session to discuss that in more detail later on in the board meeting, to have some bilateral discussions or smaller group discussions around that cooling facility and how the particular gases that the cooling project would support that are addressed as greenhouse gas refrigerants, high greenhouse gas impact refrigerants, and the Kigali Amendment of the Montreal Protocol was part of the discussion there. And then the final page of the projects, I mentioned the Desert to Power project from African Development Bank. My company was involved in supporting AFDB with that. It ticked all the boxes, and there were quite a number of comments from the board around that. It was also complimented how the African Development Bank responded to questions from the board members, specifically related to ethical labor standards, supply chains, and such like. And it was frequently mentioned that engagement with the DFI Working Group on Forced Labor is very important for accredited entities, but African Development Bank were very much complimented on how they addressed those safeguards. The Tanzania project was approved also without any comment. And then there was a lot of discussion around the Pegasus project that is here, and both of the Pegasus projects, specifically the coral reefs one. There was a lot of discussion about the no objection letters, and I think some sort of misunderstandings around that. For me, it seems a pity that the focus of the board was on an issue that I think could be dealt with much better before the board meeting. And actually the design of the project, how this project is delivering change in the coral reefs, the types of activities that the project is implementing. I think there could have been a lot more board scrutiny around that issue. Now, of course, I haven't seen the comments that were given by the board before the project, but it just seems to me that that was really a missed opportunity from board members focusing in. I personally think, just my own opinion, I don't have a background of what has happened beforehand on that project, but I would have liked to have seen a lot more of that type of discussion. And then the Pegasus project with the Craft and the Lightsmith group, that was agreed certainly without too much discussion. The concerns were raised by the CSO party. There was a response given before the board, and the board members agreed to approve that. But civil society stood against those two Pegasus projects quite firmly around the different mechanisms that were used. So that's projects and some insights into what the board was thinking there. Accreditation, I see I'm running out of time, and just say that the reaccreditation for these three organizations just went. It's the United Nations Development Program, sorry. A little mistake there on my slide, but the UNDP was approved. IUCN and Namibia, all of these had conditions put on their reaccreditation. Something strange happened with the reaccreditation of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, the DBSA. There were no conditions put on in the board documents that was originally circulated, and then conditions were introduced, and that caused a huge kerfuffle, lots and lots of questions, and really a massive blocking of the whole process of introducing this. And it had to do with points of order and how these conditions were introduced. The condition that was put on the Development Bank of South Africa apparently had been agreed by the DBSA ahead of time, but I wonder whether there was some history that I don't know about, because there was talk about DBSA being coerced around adopting those. The type of conditions that the condition that was put there had to do with the DBSA's adoption of policies related to net zero targets for 2050, as I understand it. That was one of those factors that consumed a huge amount of time within the board. Finally, these are slides showing the board meetings. So they agreed to these dates. So these are now firmed up dates. They said it may change. This is our calculation. All of what you see down here is our own calculation based on what is in the either the requirements. If you've got a category A disclosure, it has to be 90 days before a board meeting. So that is 90 days before the board meeting, the dates for it. Simply calculated 90 days before. And also the indicative timing in the GCF programming manual. So indicatively when you can expect the CIC2 meeting, the CIC3 meeting, when it would go to the ITAP, when there might be ITAP on-site visit, if that is taking place, and the publication deadline for the project. So you can see those sort of dates. We'll circulate this just in case you're targeting a particular board meeting. Say you're targeting the June board meeting, you know that that initial review needs to happen before the end of this year. These are only indicative dates. Please don't hold us to them. They're calculated just based on the information that we have, but can give you a bit of a steer around that. Right. That's all I wanted to cover. Thank you very much for your time. Please feel free to contact me if you'd like to talk more about these factors, and we'll be able to take some questions now. Right, I went slightly over time. Let's see how far we can get with questions, and we will do our best to address them. And yeah, let me just see. I'm going to see if any of them have been upvoted or given a priority. No, we've got lots of different questions. So just if there is any questions that we can't cover now, given the timing, we will send out with the replay kit for the webinar. So make sure that you're signed up to receive that from our website. We will give a written answer where we can to many of these. Yeah, I can see a few people have upvoted this question from Camille Mureni. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your question. The question goes like this: what attracts private finance, and what are the requirements, prerequisites of private investors who come to support this shortfall on finance? Margaret-Ann, would you like to have a go around that? What do you say is it that would attract private finance into climate finance projects?
Thanks so much, Grant, again for inviting me here, and thank you so much, Camille, for the question. Well, like any anything in the private sector, it just has to make good business sense, doesn't it? It really has to work from a financial point of view, and we're seeing more and more companies that are looking to participate in international climate finance, looking at blended solutions. And those just have to have, they have to have the right hurdle rates. They have to have the right type of programs, projects that align with their business development. So I think the 100 billion shortfall, this was set by the international climate finance community back in 2010. And we know we're short, but so the crowding in of the private sector capital is so important, and that's why I'm so keen to work with the GCF, to work with yourselves as well, ECO, and why I'm really happy to be able to work with the CMIA at delivering on that. So I think maybe Marcus might want to talk about this, but more than anything, what attracts private finance really simply is that it makes good business sense, but it's also doing good for the planet and doing their part to help decarbonize and find low carbon solutions. But back over to you, Grant, or maybe Marcus wants to pick up on this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, please do feel free to speak up, Marcus, if you would like to on that.
Yeah, all I would add is that I think in terms of what attracts private finance to the GCF specifically is that the GCF obviously has a mandate to disperse enormous amounts of resources. Their portfolio is now around $10 billion, and that's a huge opportunity for the private sector to scale up their projects. And what we're seeing, I think, over this board meeting and previous board meetings is a number of funds that go to the GCF asking for financing, and then from that financing they can catalyze additional co-financing. So you're seeing funds that maybe 50 or 100 million, they go to the GCF, they obtain 100 million, and then they can get additional co-investment of maybe 200-300 million. So all of a sudden they've gone from 50 to 50 or 100 million up to $500 million for their fund, which can obviously scale up and provide enormous opportunities to both tackle climate change, but also from a business perspective in terms of scaling up innovation and providing economic benefits to the private sector.
Yeah, thank you very much, Marcus. I mean, there's a little bit of schizophrenia there, isn't it? Or some other appropriate word, I'm not sure, because these funds like the GCF want private sector funding, and yet the board is quite hesitant around it. There was one of the comments from the board, one board member who said that there shouldn't, in adaptation areas, there shouldn't be any loans because, in fact, it should be entirely grants for adaptation projects, and similar sorts of comments. And we want private sector, but we're skeptical. The GCF CSOs, community civil society organizations, raising quite some concerns and actually proposing not to approve these projects, particularly the Pegasus ones there. But at the same time, I think Pegasus, it's been very hard work for them, and huge compliments to Pegasus and of course Lightsmith Group from one of them. But it's they've achieved something amazing because there's a large amount of money injected into their into their funds. So it is very attractive, as you were saying there, Marcus. Yeah, okay. I've got to go much faster. I would propose that we'll continue, if that's okay with everyone, for 5 or perhaps 10 minutes more, and then we'll close it off. If you need to drop out, we will record it and we'll pass this on to you. All right, just the next one, Deepa, you asked your question very early on, and it's really around how does one access the GCF? You said, can registered community groups access this? I'll try and give a quick answer to that. When you talk about registered, it's not clear what that means, but accessing GCF funding at the moment is only possible through accredited entities. So you have to be accredited. Community groups would need to access the funds through an accredited entity, and if they aren't accredited themselves. And very small projects, the micro projects from the GCF, have budgets of $10 million generally. We haven't seen any projects smaller than, I think, 8.7, something like that. So when you talk about community groups, it's a question of scale. Often we say those great ideas and it's 500,000. Possibly the Micronesia project from SPC, which is this enhanced direct access type of approach, where it is local authorities that are getting power to make decisions. That is the sort of route through which these smaller community groups will be able to access. Hopefully that's useful answer there. Kimboa, Richard, yes, there are criteria for reaccreditation. Essentially, you go through the same accreditation questions, providing updated information. And GCF, one of the issues with DBSA has to do with how its overall portfolio is evolving. This criteria that was added, or the request that was added for the reaccreditation, which wasn't approved in the end of the day and has been deferred. One of those factors there has to do with, for example, the organization showing that it is moving its overall investment portfolio. That's one of those example criteria. One of the questions here we have is the general application process for GCF. I can refer you to the GCF programming manual, where you'll see lots of useful information. We'll attach a link for that there. That's a big question. We have multi-day trainings that cover how you go through the process, but it is through an accredited entity. For a little bit of insight. Okay, let's see. Carl. Yeah, this is this you're mentioning here, the no objection, letter of no objection process, part of the timeframes discussion. The advantage of private finance versus the need for country ownership. Well, part of that discussion, there were, for one Pegasus, the first Pegasus project, there, on coral reefs, there were 17 letters received, but potential for another 9, if I recall correctly. 2 of those letters were not complying exactly with the requirements of the GCF. So there was some of that sort of questions and a huge amount of discussion around those particular ones. At the end of the day, Sri Lanka was missing a phrase in the no objection letter around agreeing to the sub-projects that will be funded through this fund. So that caused quite a lot of difficulty, and it is part of the process. Our understanding was the projects won't go to board unless they've got their no objection letter. What happened here is that indeed the project was cut down to those which had no objection letters, but it was pretty messy in that process, and a little, I think, a bit of a pity there. Hopefully that gives you a little insight there. Okay, I'm not sure we have time for any of the others that are here. we will address those. Just very briefly, I can just give you one little comment. Luna, your question around new developments related to the COP26, there was a long discussion about the report to the COP26. So in terms of a decision-making process, it consumed a huge, talking about COP26 consumed a lot of time of the board, just related to approval of something and changes that have been made in the reporting. Doesn't really answer your question. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to address that there, but my understanding, I didn't see any of that emerging from the board meeting itself. If you have another question, please be quick to get them up. But we will at least cover this question from Dyson Jumpa. I hopefully pronounced your name correctly. You have said, what are the requirements for project preparation and application for GCF funding for a private sector entity for a project estimated to cost between 10 and 20 million US? Wow, that's a big question. I'm happy to give you a little bit of insight into that, unless there are other burning questions. I can't answer everything here. I mean, in terms of the requirements, first of all, your project needs to be submitted through an accredited entity. So it can't be submitted directly. It needs to be an entity that has been accredited to the GCF. It is possible to apply for accreditation. It's a long process. You need to think about a year or something like that. But there are many, more than 100 accredited entities that you can approach with your project idea. And for that sort of size, you obviously need to meet the investment criteria of the Green Climate Fund. There are 6 investment criteria. It talks about impact potential. That has to do with mitigation impact or adaptation impact. And the other ones of paradigm shift potential, sustainable development potential, responding to needs of recipients, country ownership, and efficiency and effectiveness. Now, GCF have a good guidance on that, and we can send you the link for that guidance on how you do that. Essentially, the first step I would advise is to download the template for the concept note, put in your project idea there, and if you're not an accredited entity, go and talk to accredited entities. See if your idea has got some resonance for them. The size of the project, 10 to 20 million, request from the GCF. Private sector project, they're not going to give grants. Most of that wouldn't be grants. Most of that would be some loan or equity or something like that. It's that sort of thing. So that's in a very brief nutshell. Answers there. Is that useful, Dyson? Feel free to add anything there. Yeah, all right. I think, well, we can have additional questions if you like, but I think we will leave it there. We got many more questions in our session this morning. When we send out the kit, you'll see answers to those questions as well. So you'll be able to read up on those. Please do get in touch with us. We'll be sending out the replay kit to your registered email, so keep an eye out for that. If you have any specific questions, do get in touch with us. I mentioned that we are recruiting at the moment. If you have GCF experience or climate finance experience, you would like to work with us freelance basis, or you'd like to be employed, please do apply through our website, and Jessica will send a link for that soon.